We have another thank you we need to get out there real quick. Somebody that's been very important to what's going on here today. When we started meeting back in January with the planning committee, and I was the chair of the planning committee. I think we were all kind of a little naive about what it would actually take to pull something like this off, especially with the hybrid virtual component of this conference. And about a month ago, I think we kind of had that, you-know-what moment, like we might be in some trouble here. But thankfully, we had one of our volunteers, one of our great volunteers for the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority, which the Rail Authority could not work without the assistance of volunteers like this. But a homegrown Billings guy named Chad Lavacek, you might have seen Chad running around. Where's Chad? He's working. Yes, he's working. Well, you might have seen Chad. He's been over in the corner. He's got a BSPRA hat on. Chad is from Billings originally, but now lives and works in Los Angeles. There he is right there. Chad, take a bow. Chad graciously agreed to he is essentially the producer of this event and has done a fantastic job getting all the AV and everybody together and everybody on the same page. And boy, if we didn't have him, I think we'd have a train wreck is what we might have. So Chad, thank you so much for your assistance in pulling all this together at the last minute. Really appreciate it. Okay, with that, we're going to introduce our final session of the day, economic impacts and benefits. I know this is one that everybody here is really keen to talk about and really keen to hear about how will passenger rail benefit our local communities? What does it add economically? What are the economic benefits and opportunities that are opened up by having access to passenger rail service in your community? So that is our session we're going to have right now. I'd like to welcome up our moderator, Juan Escano. Juan is another one of our wonderful volunteers for the BSPRA. He sits on our finance committee. So just another way that, again, we could not function without the volunteer help and dedicated work of people like Juan and Chad and others who help us out. So Juan is going to moderate this panel, and on this panel we've also got Thomas Fryer from Alberta Regional Rail. So welcome from Canada, down from Canada, Thomas. We've got Jim Matthews again from Rail Passengers Association. Bruce Agnew with PNWAR, the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, which is a big force here in the Pacific Northwest, so we're very happy to welcome Bruce here. Laura Shabe from Jacobs, and Spencer Dodge from HDR. And Juan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm sure that you've heard this potential quote that is very popular. That says, "Go west, young man." But few of us know the second part to that. It says, "And grow up with the country." So we've discussed today a lot of different disparities, issues, and elements how we could make this happen for us. But in reality, this was said in the 1850s, and today, some states like Montana, we go without. We have elderly that cannot reach, or it becomes very difficult for them to gain access to health care in our major cities. We have disparities occurring definitely with people of color and tribal people as well. And so this continues to occur. It continues to aggravate our brain drain and impact and cause for us to be underperforming in our economy. My name is Juan Escano. I am the former city planner for the city of Polson. I've had the privilege to develop a lot of rail in different parts of the world. And I'll be moderating this particular component that is for us called economic impacts and benefits. What we're going to do slightly different with our panel is we're going to peel back that onion. We are going to specifically speak about the numbers, the whys, and the cost benefits between let's build more roads versus let's build rail. So we have those numbers. We want to share those with you. We want to have a lively discussion with the panel members. but also I'm going to come around and I'm going to have my Oprah moment, and I'm going to have you comment, have you share with us what are your thoughts regarding these potential numbers and potential benefits that we could derive as a group. So with that said, I'm going to have Thomas come up here and present our first slide, our first PowerPoint.
Thank you, Juan. The slides. Oh. My name is Thomas Ferrara. I'm a project engineer, as you probably hear from my accent, and I'm not from America. I'm not even from Canada, even though I live there now. I'm from the UK originally. I'm a project engineer. My profession is a civil structural engineer. I'm the founder and instigator of Alberta Regional Rail, which is a regional rail system in the Calgary-Edmonton corridor in Alberta that will connect all the cities, towns, and communities within that corridor. And I want to emphasize, and what I emphasize when I talk to the communities is all the communities. This isn't high-speed rail. This isn't just Calgary-Edmonton. This is all the communities in the Calgary-Edmonton corridor. The economic impacts and benefits, I think, are well known. They've been discussed a lot. But what I find is that a lot of people say, well, it's just cheaper to build a road. Let's just build a road. Why do we build rail? It's so expensive to build rail. The alternative to building rail is, of course, highway expansion. These are the numbers. The Calgary Ring Road, which is currently under construction, is budgeted to cost $5.6 million per lane kilometre. So this is, I'm Canadian, so this is all metric and Canadian dollars, but it is relevant. That's per lane. A highway is a lane in each direction, so you've got to double that, effectively, if you're building a normal road. And a per lane capacity of a highway is 1,700 passenger cars per hour. But not all the vehicles on the highway are passenger cars, and capacity is related to the speed of the vehicles as well. You know, you can park 1 million cars on a kilometre of highway, but it means they're not going anywhere. A twin railroad will cost $7 million per kilometre. For the Alberta Regional Rail, I have actually estimated fully the cost out, and it comes to just over $6.5 million, depending. A bi-level passenger coach can carry up to 360 passengers on the car. And Go Transit operates trains that are longer than 10 coaches. So therefore, one GO train an hour has a greater capacity than a 4-lane highway. But a twin railway line doesn't necessarily twin the capacity of the railway line. Normal capacity on a railway line is about 32 trains per day. Just train every 45 minutes. Twinning the line doesn't mean there's a train every 45 minutes in each direction. You can get that down to 10 minutes. But for this exercise, I'm going to say a 5-car train every 15 minutes has a greater capacity than an 8-lane highway. And a highway costs $5.6 million per lane kilometre. And a twin railway line only costs $7 million. What I'd like to end up with is a quote that I read recently. It is the railways that created the modern world we live in. The train is our past, present, and future. An invention from 1863, but even today is incredibly relevant. The solution to our transportation problems has been with us all along. All over the world, we are seeing a rail renaissance. By 2050, it is expected that 75% of our population will live in and around cities. Trains are vital to how these major centers will function and grow, and continuing to define how and where millions of us will live and work.
So there are the numbers. But I definitely want to avoid us having this kumbaya moment of, yes, there's a benefit. We know there's a benefit, but we have to ask deeper questions, more mindful questions than this. And so that, with this, I'd like to actually turn it to the panel, but I'll have them introduce themselves, explain to you their expertise, and leave them with this question. What is it that we're facing? What is the big lift that we're going to have to do as a group to get this done? Yes.
We'll start here. All right, so Jim Matthews, I'm President and CEO of the Rail Passengers Association. We talked earlier. It's great to be back. From our point of view, I'm going to pick up a little bit where I left off. From our point of view, as you know, we believe that trains can be wildly profitable, just not to the operator. And that profit is delivered to the communities served. What I did not have the chance to say is that what is the obstacle right now to progress is the mind shift that has to take place. We have to stop focusing on the word profit. We have to stop thinking of this in terms of, well, that line doesn't make money. Of course it makes money. We just have to ask who it's making money for. And if we stop and realize that these kinds of investments that we're talking about, these are very vital to the communities that are served. And what I like to explain to folks is that there's nothing radical about this idea. Governments spend money precisely to create the preconditions for the success of private capital. We have a National Weather Service, which makes sure that we don't get pummeled with hurricanes without warning or tornadoes without warning. We have a Coast Guard that patrols our fisheries and plucks sailors out of the sea. We have, thank God, an Air Force, an Army, a Navy, a Marine Corps to look after our interests. We have all of these things that we do, and we spend money as a country so that we will have a country. And we don't do this strictly so that we have a country. We do it so that we create the preconditions for commerce. That's why this is all regulated by the Interstate Commerce Clause, right? So the reason we do this is to create economic benefit. Well, what does that mean? To Juan's point, we can talk about that in these sort of vague terms, but what does that mean? What it means is jobs, access, and opportunity. And it's very easy to talk about this in an abstract way, and so I always like to try to bring it down to sort of an individual level because it helps folks to understand what we're talking about. If you take a train to Cut Bank, right? Town of very roughly 2,400 folks. And if you look at the population of Cut Bank, all those folks paying their share of federal taxes together, collectively, chip in about $12,000, $12,500 a year. That's their share of the cost of the Empire Builder. Well, because the Empire Builder stops there twice a day, and because people get on and off that train, and because when they do that, they go to the brew pub, or they stay in the hotel, or they support local businesses, or all the other things that they do, that's a benefit to Cut Bank of $379,000. Now, that's a hell of a return on investment. If I could take $12,000 and make, close to $400,000, that's a pretty good deal. And I think that makes it a little easier for folks to understand. The reason we're spending this money, the reason we're investing, is to create that $379,000 benefit to Cut Bank. And that benefit can be replicated all along the lines where we serve communities if we just make the investments and make the commitment. So, I prepared a bunch of slides which Juan instructed me we were not going to use, so I didn't use them. I'm happy to share them with anybody here who asks. And we talk about, in the slides, the different communities where we've seen this work. The Downeaster in Maine, the Virginia services, Michigan. There's all kinds of examples where you put the money in and you get many multiples out. Anywhere from 4 times to as much as 10 times what you spend on it is the return to the economy. So we can show that, we can prove it, we can discuss it at length, but the one thing I think we need to do collectively is stop having this conversation justifying a route because it's, quote, profitable. That's not what it's for. It's an economic engine, and when we look at it that way, we'll understand the value of the investment.
Let me get Laura in this mix, because I know that she's chomping at the bits there. What do you say to that, Laura?
No, I can, oh, I'm supposed to speak in this thing. Hold on. So yeah, no, I agree, but there's always a but. Yeah, I'm Laura Shea. I'm formerly with Jacobs, just started a new position with Cambridge Systematics, just to clear that up. But what do I say to that is actually what I would like to talk about a little bit is even getting slightly away from this justification of route by route, and start thinking about, and I have so much to say, so I'm hoping people will come up and talk to me later, but one thing to think about is how does this piece of the rail network work in the entire network? And then we actually start thinking about it differently. I want to pull it even out further from benefiting certain communities over other communities, because that's not really what the rail system is for. So I guess I don't disagree, but that's how you sell it to each community. But really, the idea is how am I connecting or making multiple connections to many communities and new trips that wouldn't be possible. The woman that spoke earlier, I wrote that down. That's exactly what we have trouble capturing in our current models. We like to call it induced demand. But there are new trips that are even hard to capture in a survey, right? And that's what an integrated network will get you, and then it becomes a national economic development. So that's, or even maybe better, because we're here, a regional one. And what I'd also like to add, and I don't know if John Robert is here, and he put it very well, each region has different needs. So and we're calling this, instead of rural here in Montana, frontier economies, which I found fascinating, because that is probably a different driver. And now, of course, I'm giving you a lot of information all at once. But what I was trying to talk about is how do we put this up as its own paradigm? What I do a lot of, and I mentioned this before, I do a lot of business case analysis and benefit costs, and we're always comparing it with roads, or maybe with airlines. But if you know anything about, there's a great book called Linked, maybe a lot of you have read it, and it talks about the randomness of the highway network, which is, you build a lot of roads, a lot of randomness happens, there's millions of nodes, they're all equal. And then something called, the airline, which is a scale-free network, but just so you can, and I wish I'd put the slide up now, but it's more of these lots of nodes in a certain place, and it makes different things happen, right? You're connecting different pairs there, as opposed to a road, which is considered a random network. Rail, which they didn't talk about in Linked, is in between. There's an opportunity there to start thinking about this kind of transportation, and they do this in Germany already, so it's not brand new, but a different way to link the country together for the benefit of single communities and also regions, so that you can reflect the economies, because I think the economy of certain Montana towns is going to be way different. I'm from the East Coast. We know how to do it there, but it's different here. You need different kinds of connections and different trip purposes. So I have answered no questions. I've just tried to make you think slightly differently than the usual way of thinking about the economy. I'm hoping, come talk to me, I'll explain it some more. It's probably a 1-hour talk. So thank you.
So I'm getting from this that then, and I want to give this one to Spencer, that there's an element here of, we got a little bit of work to do as far as mindset, to really shift this mindset, this paradigm of what we normally accept as, this is what it's going to be. It's going to be road forever, and we are going to ultimately wind up a sprawl and be like another LA as far as roadways and highways. Spencer, what do you say to that?
I think you're queuing me up for something I said earlier. And a point I like to make often is that if we could build ourselves out of congestion, Los Angeles would have done that already. Dallas would have done that already. But we have massive highways through there, and they're just as congested as they were. And so what I think we should take away from this is that we've got to kind of change the way we approach the conversation. We've got lots of data on the economic impacts. But what the rest of the country sometimes fails to see are the very real human stories that are behind the reasons. Our rural communities are not like our urban communities. Our access to healthcare, our access to education is different. And so we have to speak about that in a different way. I think if we can focus more on the qualitative aspect of this, and this has been talked about all day, whether it's quality of life in Cut Bank, whether it's the impacts on tribal communities as well. I think if we can kind of shift away from, well, this is the dollar amount that it's going to affect, we can come up with those. There's economists and mathematicians who are way smarter than me who can do that. But what we really need to stress to the rest of the country is that, hey, the world we live in is slightly different than the world you live in. And this is why we need these rail systems. If you look at the demographics and the way they're shifting in rural communities, we're getting older. Our young folks are leaving to go to urban centers. Why are they doing that? Well, it's access to healthcare. It's access to education. And so if we can kind of approach this in a different mindset of, well, we maybe don't need a highway. The younger generations, I'm a millennial. My little sister is a Gen Z. Creates a lot of weird situations for us. But the group that's coming up beneath me, they don't necessarily like cars. Maybe they like cars, but maybe it doesn't make sense for them. So we have to meet our communities where they are. If they're getting older, we need to make sure that we're providing access to healthcare in the ways that are most feasible. With that, I was informed my name is the last one right before dinner, so I'm going to keep it short so you guys don't blame me for keeping us from eating.
I'm gonna put one more question, and then we're gonna go to the audience because we want for you to interact with them. These individuals are incredible experts, and so the last question is how can we? Yeah, the last question would be then Bruce. This is going to Bruce. Then tell us a little bit about, transportation development, how this could stimulate the economy, and how can the big issue because this is another issue that we're currently grappling with, is housing. How can this help us with housing?
Well, that's a topic for an entire conference. Just by way of background, I'm a former local county official and from Everett, Washington. And I was a staff director to a congressman, and right now I'm here as part of a team from the Pacific Northwest Economic Region. We recently received a Build America Bureau grant for our regional accelerator, and last year we held a session with you all at Big Sky, and next year in our July summit we would like to have you co-host. We would like to host your session in Boise, Idaho. So that invitation is out there. PNWER is a public-private partnerships of 5 Northwest states: Alaska, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and Washington, and 5 Western Canadian provinces and territories. We have been doing rail, all things rail, since 2004. Great Northern Corridor, Rocky Mountaineer, Amtrak, agricultural exports, et cetera. I could give you chapter and verse of the economic benefits to a robust health system, or rail system. But I would like us to focus. I think we've heard all about the economic benefits. I don't think anybody doesn't understand that. I think there are challenges that we haven't addressed, and hopefully that will come out in the next couple of days. And there are opportunities. On challenges, there's a big political challenge. We're getting skunked back in Washington, D.C. We need Western governors, we need state rail caucuses, we need bipartisan red, blue, purple congressional caucuses to get our fair share of funding. I think John Robert mentioned that. We have some operating challenges. Over the course of rail advocacy, and I've been involved with the Amtrak Cascade since 1995, it's clear that you have to, if you want to promote passenger rail, you have to understand how railroads operate in the real world. I mean, they have questions about indemnification in case Amtrak has an accident. They have capacity issues. That's why we're big supporters of their Sandpoint Junction connection in Sandpoint, Idaho. They've got challenges with PTC deployment. They have to answer to their stakeholders, their employees, their clients. They go back and forth with Amtrak on performance standards. And the thing that really drives me crazy is by federal law, they have to haul oil and gas. It's part of the interstate system. And yet, the folks in my area, in Seattle, call them the trains of death, even though they're bringing oil from Montana and North Dakota and Wyoming and coal for export. Oil comes to our refineries. So these same folks that complain about these trains of death are the same people that go to SeaTac Airport and fly on jets from fuel that's refined in Skagit and Whatcom County. So we've got a political challenge to understand how railroads work. If they're economically, if they're working, they'll be more open for passenger rail service. And I would also suggest, I want to point out Ron Pate from Washington DOT. Ron and his staff are skilled, they're experts. They have done a magnificent job with the Amtrak Cascade. You want to talk about economic benefits. This is a program that started in 1995. It resulted in resumption of service to Canada that was discontinued in 1981. They have incredible ridership. They have a return on fare box of 60%. Our transit agencies in our state are 5 to 15%. They have incredible on-time performance. And so I hope in our next session we can dissect what's made the Amtrak Cascade so successful, because it's resulted in our state, Washington state taxpayers, since 1995 have invested $2 billion in grade separation projects, in extra trackage, in partnerships with transit, $2 billion. And that's why we have a good rail service. So their economic benefits have to be understood in the political context of what works for the railroad. And I'll end with a comment by Matt Rose, former BNSF CEO at our conference in 2015 in Big Sky. He talked about the FAST corridor, which focused on freight and the ports of Seattle, Tacoma, and Everett. That was a collaboration, and that's before all this big money came to play, to put grade separation projects in and allow rail yards to expand and all kinds of things. $658 million that made freight and the passenger trains flow through that congested metropolitan area much more smoothly. And he wished that rather than peanut buttering the 2009 high-speed rail money that was done years ago, that we would expand that collaboration with the freight railroads and the agricultural interests and the mining folks all along the northern tier, what we call the Great Northern Corridor, to make it, to magnify those economic benefits, to move people that we've talked about all day, but also, you know, provide better access for farmers and mining companies to international markets. So it needs to be a win-win, and I think we can do that in the Great Northwest.
Well, thank you. Let's expand this and then put it out to the audience to see what questions.
Hi, great presentations. I'm just going to give a question to Jim, but anybody else who wants to answer this can. Jim, you're from the aerospace industry, private pilot, right, and a colonel in the Civil Air Patrol. And let's make a comparison, because it's always priorities and choices. Let's just choose a number out of the sky, $10 billion. $10 billion. If you drop $10 billion into the airline, into the commercial airspace, would you move the needle? That's a three-part question. Would you move the needle? Would you be able to see how much you moved the needle? If you took that same $10 billion and you dropped it into interstate highway system, would you move the needle? And if you took that same $10 billion and you dropped it into long-distance passenger rail, would you see a difference?
That's a great setup. All right, so I'm going to start with, yes, I am an aviator. I've been an aviator for a long time. I fly in the system. And we have a tremendous safety record in the United States. We have the best air traffic control in the world and the safest air traffic control in the world. You know why? Because we spend federal dollars on it. And so when the airlines tell you that they're not subsidized, that is untrue. That is deeply untrue. The median salary for an air traffic controller in this country is $127,000. Median. A single flight operating between, say, Los Angeles and Baltimore, that one flight is going to be touched by 26 controllers. You have the ground folks, you have the clearance delivery folks, you have, on a really big airport, you've got several ground controllers as you're moving across the airfield, and then you've got the tower, and then you've got departure, and every one of those guys is an air traffic controller, federal employee. I don't object to that. We have a phenomenal system because of that. And what does that do for us? It creates a vibrant airline industry that can serve bazillions of people all around the world. $10 billion is kind of drop in the bucket stuff when it comes to the national airspace system. If you compare the investments in the what's called next gen, which is the air traffic control radar system replacement, where we're now going to the sort of distributed model, 10 billion is a drop in the bucket. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of that program. Highways, we spend $72 million a mile on highways and nobody bats an eye. $10 billion, you can do the math. It's better than the poke in the eye, but it doesn't get you that far. $10 billion in the long distance passenger rail space could make a lot of things possible. Particularly, to Bruce's point, that if you're in partnership, if you're not if you're not working against the class ones, but you're working in partnership. And there are plenty of examples where that can be done. We've seen it. There's also plenty of examples where it works terribly because nobody wants to get along. So the premise of the question, $10 billion, you can do a lot of good in long-distance passenger rail with $10 billion, a lot more good than you could in, say, next gen. But that's not to say that one is superior to the other. Part of that is because they have a head start. We spend money on next gen because we care about it. And maybe we haven't cared enough as a country about long-distance passenger rail up until now. And we just fixed that in this last Congress. So now it's up to us to make sure it gets spent right. Anybody else want to?
I could answer. I had the benefit of working in Germany as well as at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, where both of these questions were brought up. Again, the airport system in Germany, you need to connect it to rail. So it goes back to this, it's not an either or question. It's the airport creating a node for rail, not a node for highways like we do here, but a node for rail, and then those trips being. So that's one thing. So $10 billion, we could probably get a really good connection to, some of the key airports. I'm looking at Ron as well. We looked at some of this during the ultra-high-speed ground transportation. What's the benefit of connecting a new rail line to airports? Secondly, at the Port of New York and New Jersey, again, sadly, the biggest facility in terms of revenue there is the George Washington Bridge. Surprise. It's not JFK. And then again, the PATH system, also more ridership than it's equal to about JFK in terms of riders, people going in and out per year or per day. So, it's sort of a fallacy to think that transit or, and the PATH system is rail. So it's a fallacy to think that rail isn't really doing stuff. And someone actually mentioned that too before with the long distance ridership. Where we're missing it here in the States is, again, these connections to nodes and building out those nodes and creating a redundant system. Another example, and that's why even the long distance corridor, I'm trying to think, looking at, I have two things to say, but what are the connections between some of these parallel? Can we do that? Is there land in between? I know it's difficult, there's the topography, creating a redundant system so it works better, right? Airplanes have easy redundancy because they can fly somewhere else. Creating redundancies in the system, that's where I would target my $10 billion connections to airports. And I think you could do a lot with $10 billion because there's gaps. that are easily made. Yeah, that's my answer to the question. Do you want to say something? Yeah, awesome.
So I've done a complete estimate on the Calgary-Edmonton corridor. It's about 305 kilometers long. And the total cost, and this includes pretty much everything. So twin line, rolling stock, I think it's 23 bridges, so road over rail bridges for grade separation to improve safety. 23 stations. I think it's 25 enhanced grade crossings, because in the urban areas you can't build a bridge because you want to maintain the urban environment. So you do an enhanced grade crossing for not only safety of passengers, preventing collisions, also for whistle cessation as well to improve the communities. So you don't have the trains blowing their horn all the way through all the time. So rolling stock, I think I've got about 11 train sets. It's about $2.9 billion. That's Canadian dollars. So that's how much. That's 305 kilometers fully twinned. Stations in Edmonton, stations in Calgary, 23 stations in total. On the long-term plan for the Calgary metropolitan region, there's something called the Airdrie Bypass. It's to take the congestion of the QE2, which runs the corridor, around Airdrie to prevent the congestion through Airdrie. It's about 25 kilometers long. It's estimated to cost $15 billion. The Southwest Calgary Ring Road costs $7 billion. So this is what you can do with rail. And you build it freight compatible. As I said before, twinning the line. It doesn't double the capacity, because that would mean there's a train every 45 minutes in either direction. You can get that down to 10 minutes. How many trains is that a day? 240? I got various different calculations, and I think one is at 288 trains a day. 288 from 32 to 288. That's 8 times the capacity. With enhancing the rail lines, you can make the trains faster. So not only do the freight trains have to run at 90 kilometers an hour, they can up their speed to 110. So you get faster movements of the freight. Safer as well, because you're going to eliminate all the grade crossings. So there's no more at grade crossing collisions, delaying the freight. So it's not only benefit to passengers, there's also a commercial element as well. It means that markets are more interconnected and more accessible. You can get, we do the Red Deer region building an economic center. They can then get access to their markets to the Pacific Coast a lot quicker, a lot safer, and they have other markets down into the United States as well. It opens up a lot more commerce for the economic regions. Doesn't help, it's not just passengers. Yes, it helps passengers get to their medical appointments, but there's a business element as well that allows more development of the economics.
Okay, I think we have another question here.
Just as a follow-on to the comment by Jim Matthews about profit, when the Intercontinental Railroad was proposed by Abraham Lincoln and followed on by President Andrew Johnson, the federal government gave millions of acres to the railroads to build this Intercontinental Railroad. So profit was not then a motive. And that point was emphasized this morning by the statement by the governor of North Carolina. So I would say that for those who, from a historical perspective, and for those who are concerned about original intent of our founding fathers, profit was not a motive in establishing the Intercontinental Railroad. And I think we could, take that forward as a motivation for expanding the railroad today.
Great. Any additional questions?
So Stephen Hunt, City of Boise, I live in Boise, I work for Valley Regional Transit, the transit agency in Ada and Canyon County. And so the question that I have, I really like this, the concept, the discussion you've been having about the mind shift from about profitability. But I guess what sticks, the conversations that I have about trying to grow transit in Idaho, we have a really challenging funding environment where there isn't actually a dedicated funding source for transit. So we're always trying to make the argument to our elected officials as to why transit's a good thing, and we give all the reasons that we've talked about thus far. And the issue is that they don't disagree. They just have other things to do with money. And so I guess my question or comment is, are there examples where beyond just making the mind shift about moving away from profitability, what do we need to do to create a cycle of revenue that can go towards supporting the creation of the rail systems or transportation systems we need? Because I think one of the reasons that roads work is because I know it's not all paid for from the gas funds, but there is a really direct kind of revenue stream that's built into how we build roads. And what's your ideas about how can we capture a lot of the revenue from the benefits that rail can bring or transit can bring to communities?
The situation in Idaho is completely different from the situation in Washington State, where the transit advocates, both urban and rural, are very powerful. The transit agencies in Washington State, 12 or 15 of them or so, they collect $33 billion. And the state DOT budget, I think, Ron, is around 5 or, you know. So in our state, it's not a matter of money. The challenge we have is the demographics, because there's transit districts that are old county transit districts, and yet people are living further out, whether they're working remote or whether they can't afford affordable housing in Seattle or Bellevue. So if you don't have a healthy inner city regional transit system, and we do in our region, we have Sound Transit, which runs Sounder on the Amtrak Cascades route. If you don't have that, people can't get there. We have folks in Bellingham that need to go to a hospital in Seattle. They can pay a lot of money for Uber or Lyft, or they can switch transit buses 3 times in the middle of the night to get down to Seattle, or they could take the train, which is comfortable and easy. So I suggest that blending transit funding with inner city rail funding can be a very powerful political coalition. And then the other thing is public-private partnerships. I just mentioned Uber and Lyft. Our transit agencies are finding that it's better to put their resources into high-capacity transit and leave the so-called arteries of the system, leave the capillaries to human service organizations or Uber or Lyft or contracted services that are on demand that allow you to get to that transit center or that rail station any time of the day, not the fixed bus local service, but any time of the day. So transit needs, and I'm a former transit board member, they need to figure out public-private partnerships to share those costs, whether it's major companies providing subsidies, but there are innovative ways of doing things. You just have to understand where people live and work today is different than it used to be.
I think we could have another opportunity for any additional questions. If not, we'll just leave it with the panel and have them share their last thoughts.
There's a question over there.
Thank you. My name is Jeff Broderick, and I'm an urban planner in Oregon and Washington. One of the reasons I wanted to come to this conference was I'm interested in ways to fund rail projects in a sustainable fashion. I know that there's been a tremendous amount of money put toward rail in the last year or two, to the point where I have concerns about how is Amtrak going to be able to efficiently spend this money. And we've kind of touched on some of these topics, but I would like to get some ideas from the panel what your long-term ideas are for sustainable funding models for passenger, not just capital projects, but also operating funds on a long-term basis. This is assuming after all of the recent money has been spent. So this is like 10, 15, 20 years down the line.
Yeah, I'll start here. I think that before we can even get to that conversation, we have to have a system that needs to have operations, right? So I think to kick things off, right, we need to figure out how can we leverage federal dollars for rural areas. I would follow then, I really don't know if we need to come up with sustainable ways to fund this. If you look at whether it's the interstate highway system, that's, like we mentioned, the gas tax doesn't pay for that. That's not a sustainable funding source. Most airports have some level of subsidy behind them, so that's also not a sustainable revenue source. And so, again, we need to change the paradigm of how we talk about this. This is a service, right? It's not necessarily a profitable business. The U.S. Postal Service was created as a service, not necessarily as a private corporate entity. And so, you know, I'm not answering your question because I'm not sure I necessarily feel like the question is fair to a transportation system.
I could add something to that. Oops, just one more. So I think there's some examples, and I totally agree with Spencer. But there are examples. You know, if you look at the MTA, you know, how do they fund it? You could, the 20-year plan. The planning for how that's done, right? The two largest commuter railroads in New York, you know, been there a long time. How do they do their ongoing funding? And then there was another one that's out of my, you know, there are some ways that, again, but none, it's never going to be completely paid for, right? I think some of the most, I worked at the Long Island Railroad. There were branches that were 80% paid for by the fare box revenue, but all of these examples that I could give you about other agencies and how they do it still it's not applicable to the Montana example. So I think that's the most important thing. There's not one way to do it. And you had a follow-up to what I was.
I may not have been clear in what I was saying, but when I'm saying sustainable funding model, I'm not talking about that it is turning a profit.
Okay. Right.
But 5 or 10 or 20 years down the line, how can we assure that the rail mode is still receiving enough money for society? We would feel that it's beneficial to keep funding that. I'm not expecting intercity passenger service to be turning a profit, but how would we assure that there's a baseline of funding on an ongoing basis so we can
We all went, so I think one, and then I'm going to give it to Thomas.
Yeah.
So look at, you know, the one thing the Northeast Corridor did with PREA funding is a great example of looking out many, many years and looking at the users of the different, you know, pulling the states together. That's the other bigger, you know, that's a big corridor model for sustainable funding source, and everyone had to sign on. It took years to put together.
I think we're running over time, but
let Thomas answer.
Go for it.
Okay, the greatest cost to rail is the infrastructure. And as soon as that's built, it is generally profitable because a lot of the revenue will exceed the costs. But it's also, people will use it. You build it, they will come. People will ride it. The more people that ride it, then the more people are interested in it, and the more advocacy you can get to maintain it. And then you have the passenger railroad associations and advocacy groups that will keep on funding it. And you can look across Europe at all the different things that's there. People want to see it maintained. As soon as it's viable, as soon as people see, oh yeah, I can do that. All right, I want this maintained. I want this to keep going. And then other people see it, and other people see it, and it keeps on going. It's a snowball effect. You've got to, first of all, you've got to build it. So the $66 billion needs to put in the infrastructure to do it, first of all. And then people will come, people will use it, and they'll say, we want to keep this. But the major cost has already been sunk. And so any future will be on expansions to make it better, not to necessarily maintain it, because the ridership will maintain it.
A round of applause to our panel.
All right, yes. Thank you, Juan. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Spencer. Thank you, Jim. Appreciate your time. All right, everybody. Well, that concludes our panel sessions for day one.